Daves is known as one of the best shallow water bass fishermen today, winner of the BASS Illinois Invitational and 12-time qualifier to the Bassmasters Classic. Woo knows river fishing as well as anyone, living on the James River in Virginia. Woo has mastered the tips and techniques to catching more river bass. This video was shot over 2 seasons, both near the East Coast and in the Midwest, from rain and clouds to bright sun and high-pressure skies. Ride along with Woo and learn from the expert on river fishing, ways to catch more bass.
Come on out of there. That's what I like about that heavy line. You can bust them. Come on out of there. Yeah, buddy. Come out of there. Come out of there. Come here, big boy. Now that right there is a nice grass bass, a typical river bass. Caught him out of grass. This is the same type grass where I won the Illinois tournament on. I'm gonna put him back and let him grow up. Catch him again. Thank you. But a lot of people would ride down this bank and you look at this grass and you say, well, gee, it couldn't be 2-3 inches of water there. That stump sticking out of the water and everything, but I want to show you something. You saw where I caught that bass down in there. You watch this rod tip when I stick it down in this grass. I mean, you got your grass out here, you got about 2.5 foot of water. But even back over here where we caught that fish, you know, you look at there, you got about that much water. There's still 2 feet of water in there. Plenty of room for a bass, and what more does he want? He's got shade, plenty of thick cover, good place to hide, and this was just a nice little key place because it had the extra stump in there, which was just, you know, a little bit of ketchup on his hamburger. But that's a key prime place, and that's exactly how I won that tournament in Illinois, flipping a worm right over in that thick places of grass, about 1.5 to 2 foot of water. I just, you know, when I see grass, I get excited on a river. That's all I can say. Well, welcome to the video, and you know, we're not only going to talk about grass here, but we're going to talk about river ledges, laydowns, duck blinds, drop-offs, bars. I just don't, just a whole list of things that you can learn to fish in rivers. We're going to also go over a lot of different lures, techniques, how we fish them, how to make casts and everything. I'm really excited about this video because I love to river fish. I've had probably some of my best tournament finishes on rivers in the classics, and also in winning the invitational on the Illinois River. And I consider myself a pretty decent river fisherman, and I'm gonna try and show you everything I've learned about fishing in rivers. And we can't get everything in the tape, but believe me, you're gonna get well more than your money's worth by watching this tape and reviewing it, and go back over it. You know, don't just look at it one time and throw it up on the shelf, because you'll forget a lot of the things. Go over it 3 or 4 times, try and remember the things that I'm telling you, and get out there and try them. Good luck, and let's go on with the video. You know, we've pulled in here on a typical island that we find on most all our major river systems. And one thing you don't ever want to pass up, because it's usually you can find fish on one end of these islands or the other. There's going to be bars coming up, usually a longer bar off the lower end where your currents float over. And a lot of times on the upper end, there'll be a smaller bar. One thing I find on the upper end, you get a lot more logs jammed in usually than you do on the lower end. And I'll fish in close up on that end with a spinnerbait or a worm or a jig. And when I come to the lower end where I've got these long bars, they might run out here. Sometimes I've seen them run for a mile below the islands, just a continuation of the land, but it's underwater 3 or 4 feet. And a lot of times you'll find logs jammed in on this, or stumps. And the stump might be sitting up there in just say 2 foot of water right on top of that drop off, but generally it's probably 7 or 8 foot right in front of that stump. and the fish can move right up in the roots and stuff of that stump. Even though you see the stump there, there's a lot of roots down under the water and everything that you don't see that'll hold the fish. When I get to the lower end of the island, then I go to the Carolina rig more and bait like a rattle trap or some kind of deep running crankbait, and just simply flip it up over the top of the bar and bring it off. And generally you're going to get the strike. I mean, as soon as you know you've come off the bar and reeled it 2 or 3 feet, if you didn't get a bite, get your bait right on back in real quick and get it back over there again. And you can generally work these areas real close. You don't have to stay way back and make a cast a mile long. Stay kind of close because you've got a little bit of current usually, and it's generally stained up water, so the fish are really not that spooky. There's one that come off the end of the bar. I hope it's a bass. Hey, look at here. Now how's that? Now he came right off the end of that bar, out here in about 4 foot of water, probably on a little gravel or something out there that we couldn't see. Get the old rattle trap. And that's a nice 14 and a half inch fish. And that's kind of a bonus for me because I'm not the greatest smallmouth fisherman in the world. So we're gonna let you go. A lot of our rivers in Mississippi, a lot of the inland rivers are just loaded with smallmouth bass. And that's just a bonus when you catch one. But I mean, a lot of times on a little point like this, and you got that gravel, you're liable to catch 10 or 20 of them. I know Stacy King, a friend of mine, he's caught them bunched up several times like that. And so just like I say, work these bars all the way out, and don't be surprised if you catch a lot of fish. You know, here's a beautiful bank, got a little undercut, got a nice stump here, a little bush hanging in the water here. But all down through here in a river, when that current's coming through here, each one of these places is creating a current break. That bass gives them a place to hide. Instead of just an old straight bank, this is real irregular, and again, a lot of current breaks. What's happened here, the water's washed in against this bank, and actually, you look at the bank right there, but there's a hole that goes back up under that bank. It gives that place for the fish to hide. I always call it just like a drive-up window in one of our fast food restaurants. You just sit there and come along, somebody hands them a meal out the window. You know, this is a typical log jam you'll find on most all your river systems. Again, it's where we've had high water. These logs are washed in here. We might come back next year and half of these will be gone. But this is a dynamite place to catch fish. Don't never pass this up. All of them, usually they're up anywhere in real shallow, running out into 2 or 3 foot of water. You got all kinds of roots, wood, anything will hold bait fish. Crawfish will hang around here, and the bass love it. I've probably caught as many fish off of this type of structure as anything I've ever fished in a river. And the first thing I would probably look for when I came to a river would be laydowns just like this, using a small 4.5 inch, hopefully it's a woo worm, that's my favorite. Usually in a dark color if you got dingy water, maybe a chocolate orange tail or a green pumpkin. Just kind of flip it around these logs. Keep your sinker down like 1/8 of an ounce where you get kind of a slow fall because you're generally, again, in shallow water. And work each piece of cover real good. Don't just pull in there and flip your worm or jig or spinnerbait over there one time and go right on up to the next log. Make 4 or 5 casts around each one of them. You know, that fish could be laying anywhere around in there. You don't know what's under the water. A lot of times at home on a river I fish a lot, I'll get out and wade around these logs because sometimes it might be a 3 foot hole right over in there that you wouldn't know about. It might be another log under the water, something that would create a current break. And that's how I learn a lot of the structures around my house. I just get out and wade around and feel what's in there. But fish each particular limb and work it slow. In this area right here, you might pull 5 or 6 fish off this one little area. It's really a dynamite looking spot. You know, one thing about fishing these laydowns and stuff on rivers, If you flipped your worm in there 4 or 5 times and hadn't had a fish hit it, pick up a spinner bait and just run it through there a couple times. It can make a lot of difference. I've seen a lot of times fish that log with a worm, not get a bite, come through there with a spinner bait and catch a couple fish on back-to-back casts. And maybe come back 5 minutes later and they won't touch the spinner bait and they'll hit the worm. But I think you get a slow fall with a worm or a jig and it's a slow action and the fish sits there and watches it. You pull the spinner bait by there, you throw it out and it comes by real fast and it's kind of, you get that reaction strike. That fish sees it and he knows he's got to get it right then or he's not going to have a chance to get it. So work these areas with both lures. Again, make 5 or 6 or 7 casts to each piece of structure because that fish will lay there. I've seen many a time a guy make 2, 3 casts, move up to the next structure, and his partner throws back there and catches a 4-pounder. There he is. He boiled it good. Where is he? There he comes. Well, I love it when they hit that spinner bait. Come on in here, Big Daddy. I mean, he like took the rod out of my hand. That's a nice river fish too. That is a pretty river fish. Come on. I like to have about 5 of them in the tournament. Ha! Come here to Daddy. Yes. Now that's a nice river fish. The old Mepps Bass Killer. About a 3-pounder. You can average 3 pounds in the river, you're going to usually be doing really good. Pretty fish. I appreciate it. I want you to go back, get a little bit bigger. You know, in the 2 videos we've done on river fishing, one being Tidewater where I kept the bait small, now we're talking about major river systems, and I like to, you know, fish a little bit bigger baits there. If you'll notice here, I've got everything laid out just a little bit bigger. You know, your small baits will still work, but I like to use a bigger buzz bait, a 1/2 ounce, Lunker Buzz by Mr. Twister. Another real good item to use on a major river in the summer is a jigging spoon. Get right on the edge of your drop-offs and stuff. A lot of fish caught with those. A lizard, still use that little short worm. 3/8 ounce to a 1/2 ounce Bass Killer spinner bait. Notice my crankbaits, bigger, Pose 300, maybe a Pose 400, Bagley DB3. In a river system, major rivers, you got bigger bait fish and you don't have as much current generally, so you have a little better bass. You know, getting down to my last 2 lures here, I saved them for last. They're my 2 favorite. Probably a Jigging Pig, Uncle Josh Pork, number 11, and a J-Mac jig, 3/8 ounce, 1/2 ounce, black and blue. I don't leave home without it. And probably my other favorite is a bigger worm, an 8-inch Mr. Twister Phenom worm. This particular worm is the one I won the Illinois Invitational on. And I only had 8 of them when I got out there, and I had to make them last all week. But flipping in grass in the fall, I found out that this big worm on a river system will catch a lot of nice fish. I don't know what it is about it. I usually stick with a smaller worm, but in the fall, I want to take this big worm and throw it. I tell you what, let's go out here and go fishing. Here's a classic example of a duck blind, and one of the bigger ones, and you find these on just about every river system also. You can see right here he's got his little boardwalk for his dog coming down in the water. And the water's down right now, but you can imagine if the water's up, that's a good piece of structure to flip around right there. You can see up under here you got a lot of shade, and where they've taken all the Christmas trees and stuff and jobbed them in the ground all around. It just makes a good place for a bass to hide. They like to get back in that shady spot. Again, usually it's the only major piece of structure around. You know, here we do have lily pads mixed in with this one, but a lot of the rivers you'll just have this one duck blind, so it's a place for everything to congregate. The bait fish, the bass again. I like to flip a worm around them. Run a buzz bait down beside them, shallow running crankbait around the corners. usually in a condition like this, when you get a strike, you got to be pretty fast. You hook that fish, try and get him away from that structure in a hurry, because all these little cedar trees and stuff they've got down in there, kind of like a little fence, that bass will try and wrap you up in there in a hurry. So if you get a bite, you want to set the hook and try and kind of horse him out of there in a hurry. And boy, this would be a good spot. If the water was up, say like three more feet as it is in the spring, or even 2 feet here, it would really make a difference. The bass get all up in there, that way that brush is actually washed up under that duck blind and everything, and then you've got the shade created by the duck blind over top of it, a little washed out bank also. That would really be a key place. And you'd look for something like that. You got to visualize a lot of times when that water's up around that duck blind, that's what's under there. That's what you're looking at. And that's why they're such key fish holding structures, because they give shade and they usually have cover, old trees and stuff that they fell off the blind and everything. So that's a good place to fish. Anytime you go out on a body of water, be it a lake or a river, be sure and get you a good map. Most people think about a river as just an old straight bank water system, but it's actually a lot of cuts, creeks, and a lot of things we've talked about in the video and going to talk about. So get that map, study it, and look for these places to fish. Start out with, I'm going to start out up here near the top of the map, and this little area right here is a place that you might ride by 100 times and not know was there if you didn't have a map, because a lot of these little entrances won't be any wider than a boat. You'll look at the bank, see a little bitty creek there and think there's nothing there, and you can take your boat and get over in here and maybe go around one little bend, and here you are in a nice big little lake back in here, or a backwater slough. A lot of your standing timber will be back in here and grass, and maybe you might find your lily pads back in this area. So that's one key place. The second one, coming down here, we've got a couple of islands, and as you see this section right in here between this island, it's probably not very deep between these two islands, maybe 3 or 4 foot deep. This is an area that we talked about, that you've got that underwater bar that'll have stumps on it, maybe little rock piles, even a lot of little ditches come out through these places. So that's another place we would want to fish, both ends of this. Remember, the lower end usually has a longer underwater place, but in a situation like this with 2 islands, probably this whole section would just be a nice underwater bar, deep water on both sides, be a good place to fish. Coming down, here's a couple flats that you can notice. Back in here would probably be a big flat area where your logs and stuff would lodge in. Maybe 2, 3, 4 foot of water. Might find some lily pads back in here. And this would also be good places that I've showed you to look for spawning fish in the springtime, back in these flats, back in these little pockets. As we come around, we've got a nice river bend here. And one thing I like about this river bend that's different from the other ones on the map, if you look at it, is you've got a creeks coming in. 2 creeks right in the bend. So that would probably be 2 of the best points on this river system up in this area that I would want to fish. Actually 3 points, because where it makes up back in here. But that would be a key place to look for bass. Coming down into these other bends on down the river, and as you can see all through here, we've got our little, again, backwater sloughs and just little guts going all off that could produce fish, because they can get in here, get out of the current. But in these bends is where we might jig a spoon, look for a little drop off. We might turn around and fish the inside of this bend, because usually it'll be a flat that comes out here and drops off. You know how always people tell you look for the high bluff and run that side? That's where your deep water is. So we can turn around here and come across sometimes and find a flat up here to fish. And as you come on down, we basically got another nice creek that comes in here, another big creek down here, another island that's probably going to have a bar or something running off, like where I caught that smallmouth. So this shows you that a map can show you so many more things that you don't know are there. There's another key thing that you want to do. Rent you an airplane. Get your buddy to go with you for $50 or $60. You can fly this whole lake in an hour, and you're only spending $30 a piece, and you'll see a lot of these backwater sloughs that I'm talking about that you probably never knew was there. You know, here's another thing that flying's good for. It'll show you a lot of things that this map won't show you. Where are your lily pads? Where are your grass? Where are your log jams? So that's another 3 or 4 key fishing things that you can learn from the air that you'll never be able to find out from a map. Let's get on back out here and do some fishing. You know, a lot of times running straight down a riverbank, you'll be running along on a nice level, say 10, 15 foot straight, and all of a sudden your depth finder will start coming up. As you can see here, it's just coming right on up, 10, right on up to 5, and you go along a ways and run along in that 5 foot range, and then all of a sudden there it is, it's falling right back off. And what this has showed me is I've come across a hump or underwater like point that maybe ran off that riverbank. I'll come back, put a couple depth markers out, maybe mark the end of it in 2 or 3 places. Sometimes these things will be 100 yards long, sometimes they'll be 300-400 yards long. And I'll just fish down them with a Carolina rig or a deep running crankbait and look for stumps and little rock piles and stuff. And this can produce a lot of key fish, especially if you got a current condition. Fish coming up behind the boat. Coming around the boat, over top of the, coming back, coming back, coming back, coming back. You ought to get another jump out of this sucker right here. Come on, come on. No. Do something for me. That's a pretty little fish. Finally. Thank you, man. It's been a while. The old spinnerbait over the grass. Anytime you can find this hydrilla, milfoil, or anything like that just under the water, especially on a cloudy day, pick up a spinnerbait. All we've done here, we found a little ridge that runs out and it's got that hydrilla and milfoil growing on it, and you find that in a lot of your river systems. Cloudy day, pick up a spinnerbait, especially when you got a little bit of a breeze, and just roll it around over top of that grass. I hope it'll be a Mepps, that's my favorite. You know, a lot of times when you're fishing rivers and stuff, you've got a lot of brush and key treetops and everything. Everybody that might come through that area will hit it, and then you'll have one little twig sticking up all out by itself, like this one right here. And I like to just pitch my worm. I try and hit every one of those little types of things, because you don't know what's under the water, for one thing, that might be holding the fish. And the other thing is, a lot of people overlook a little old stick or one little old twig sticking up and say, oh, there ain't no bass there. Look at that big pretty tree over there. And you'd be surprised at the fish you can catch around little stick-ups and twigs like that. That's just a little tip. You know, don't bypass, even if you have to go out of your way a little bit. If you're fishing in a lot of brush and you see one twig out there 40 yards, go out there and fish that thing every time, because probably everybody else has left it alone. And you might find yourself catching a nice bass right there. Oh man, he's wrapped up in that tree. Come out though, down in another tree. Come out, oh yeah, come on. Down in another one. That's what I was talking about, right in the center of those brush piles. Drop your worm in there and hang on. Now that's getting more up to a little more nicer, what I call a river type, and that's about the average, you know, nice sized bass that runs in most of your river, and that's about maybe a 2 1/4, 2 1/2 pounder. Eat my worm up. That's a pretty fish. Thank you. I enjoyed that. Grow up. I'll be back to see you on the next trip. You know, another key place in your oxbows and your major river systems and back in your backwaters is standing timber. You know, you got root systems around all these trees. The fish like to spawn around trees. And I like to go in the spawning season. I always like to key around the biggest trees. You know, if you look in this area, you'll see there's 4 or 5 trees that are bigger, maybe twice as big as the rest of them. And I like to key on them first because I think the bass like to spawn around them. You know, maybe the brim and everything else might be spawning around them. I don't know exactly what holds the fish, but I like to key on the biggest standing timber that's in there. One other thing about standing timber, a lot of times your bigger trees will be in the deepest water a lot of times. When you're coming down the middle of a slough or something, you can kind of tell if there was a little creek channel that eventually came through there at one time, your biggest trees will grow right along the edge of that channel, especially if you're in cypresses. A couple good key target areas right here. If you were back in here fishing, I'll show you. You've got a big tree and you got a little bushy tree growing right next to it with about an 18-inch to 2-foot section in there. And then if you'll just look back to the next tree right back here, you've got a lay-down log right next to it. And to me, that would be the 2 key casts in this whole area right here, because it's something extra there that would hold the fish or give a little more sun, you know, block the sun or something. So anytime you're in an area, if you've got a lay-down log against a tree, or you've got another little tree coming up right next to it, I always like to flip my jig or worm right in that hole or run my spinnerbait through there, or whatever particular lure the bass seem to be biting on that day. That's just a nice key spot to key on when you're in a big area and you're wondering, well, there's 50 or 60 trees in here, which one's going to have the bass on it? Always look for one with a lay-down log against it or another little tree growing up right next to it, and that'll be your key cast. Now here's another good tree. If you'll notice, this tree, it's got a bunch of vines growing off of it. You got a little tree with some nice little limbs, but it's got a bunch of those vines, and they keep right on down in the water, and that's a good place for that bass to get right in there and hide. Anytime you see something different, see, there's several trees around here, but this is the only one that's got a bunch of vines in it. And again, that's just another place for minnows and stuff to hide. And if you got the bait fish there, you're going to have the bass there. Always look for something that's a little bit different when you're fishing. There he is. Come on. That's a good fish. Come to daddy. Whoa, son. Now that's what we've been looking for. J-Mac jig, 3-pound bass. Not bad. You know, pitched right in there next to that tree right there. And he nailed it. Small tree, big tree, about a 2-foot little hole right in there. I'm gonna let you go back and grow up. Maybe I'll get you again next year. Thank you, big boy. You know, another thing about these backwater sloughs and river-type fishing, it can get 100 degrees out, be really hot. And everybody says, well, geez, the fish have gone out in the middle of the river, they're 40 foot deep. Forget this. You know, there's gonna be fish out there, but don't be scared to go back in a foot of water in hot weather. There's something about rivers that are different from lakes, that those fish will get way back in shallow water, a foot of water sometimes, and a lot of people overlook these places, but I can guarantee you when those pros hit that river, they'll get way back in there and try that real shallow water with a buzz bait or even a worm or a spinner bait, and you'll be surprised in the middle of the summer. I remember down at Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a lot of the fish, the Classic was one in deeper water, but I know like second, third, and fourth, a lot of the guys were fishing up real shallow water, the trolling motor kicking up mud, and it was a 90 and 95 degrees every day. So don't be scared to get way back in that shallow water and search it out to see if there isn't some bass back there. You know, we've come back in here in this little sand pit or gravel pit on a nice rainy day, and just fishing around the side of this little point here where they kind of, you can see they've dug the gravel out, and it's a nice little drop off when you come out off that point. And Should be some bass holding right along here. This is the type of area I want to look for. It's just the corner of a point. It's something a little bit different. Again, there's holes and stuff where they've dug all that in here. It might be 3 foot deep here and 10 foot deep there. And again, you just want to kind of pay attention to your depth finder. See what depth water you're in when you start catching fish, and you'll know what to look for, because there's little humps all out in here underwater that you can't see, that we've showed you on the graph, and what the humps and stuff look like. Again, that's just where they've dug down in there and dug sand up, maybe pile some over here or missed some sand. Perfect place for bass to hang around. And again, just search around in that area with a little while with your depth finder and you can find these places. But in the springtime, most of the time the fish are going to be around the shore spawning, up there trying to make their nest and everything. As it gets a little bit later into the summer, start looking out toward these humps and deeper little points back in these places to find your fish. You know, this is a classic summertime spot. We've got a river ledge that runs all the way down through here. Everything's basically the same on this ledge. It comes out to 7 or 8 feet and then drops into 14 foot. But this one little area's got just a little bitty hump on it that rises up maybe 3 feet. Riding down through here with a depth finder one day, I happened to stumble across it. Found out it had a couple stumps on it, and it's really just a key place to fish. So keep your eye on that depth finder when you're riding these river ledges. Look at your map. You know, there's a lot of good maps out now on most of your river systems, and I think the river systems actually have better maps than a lot of times than a regular lake does, because of all your boat traffic and everything, and ships that have to travel that river. So you can get that map and study it just a little bit and get your depth finder, and you know, the map may not pinpoint exactly where that place is, but it'll put you real close to it in just a few minutes of riding. You shouldn't have any trouble finding the spot. Just work up and down it with a Carolina rig or a Texas rig like we're doing here today. We're going to get us another woo worm out of here. Come on, Big Daddy. All right. I love it. The woo worm has scored again out here on this structure. Not a monster, but we'll take him. We will take him. Let's try the old spinning rod. See how that one works in there. Pulling along. Typical place. You're riding the ledge on up the edge of the river, and you know it's a drop off there, and everything looks the same, and all of a sudden your depth finder comes up 3 feet, 3 or 4 foot. That means there's something just a little different in the bank there, and that's where you want to throw. Carolina rig, Texas rig, deep crankbait. Good fish, good fish. Good fish. Yeah, buddy. Come on. Come on. He's pulling. Yes, sir. The woo worm scores again. 2 consecutive casts. Nice little, about 2.5. Grow up. Come back to see me. There he is. Feels like a good one too, right off the edge of that drop off. I felt that lure hit a stump. Bam, he nailed it. Jump for Big Daddy one more time. Yeah. He's a little on the mean side this morning. I don't blame you. Barely got him hooked too. Look at that. That is lucky. Right, one little hook right in there. We might get him in, we might not, but we're gonna. He is not hooked very good. Oh boy, look at that. He's been hooked before too. Man, I just had him by a little piece of skin. Nice job, go back, grow up. Heading right back for that ledge. You know, this is probably one of the classic examples, and probably, if you take the Bassmaster Classic, 50 to 60% of the summertime classics have been won off of areas like this, or probably 60% of the fish have been caught off of them. Simply a river bend comes around, and it just extends on out here. We've got probably 3, 4, 5, 8, 7, 8, 10 foot of water going on down for a half a mile, and it drops right off. And it just makes a real nice bend right here. So when that water's coming down, it's actually kind of flowing up over top of that bend as it kind of curves around. And this is really a good one because it's got another river coming in from an angle there. But with this water flowing over that little deal there, it's a perfect place for the bass to be up on, just like that one was. And when the current hits it, you can just about count on fish to be there. Several lures we're going to use here would be a deep diving crankbait like I'm using here. Again, I'm probably throwing into about 5 at this particular spot of it, and pulling it off into 10 or 12 foot. As I move down a little bit, it's going to get a little deeper. And I'm going to be throwing into 10, maybe pulling down into 20. So I might go to a deeper running crankbait or even a weighted crankbait to get it down there where I'm still bumping that bottom. Another good outfit here is like take a Mr. Twister lizard on a Carolina rig, or a woo worm on a Carolina rig to find the fish. A lot of times you'll fish down this area for a couple hundred yards, and this is one thing about a river bend that you need to spend a little time on. Don't just pull in there and make 8 or 10 casts. Fish the whole thing out, because when you find the fish, a lot of times they'll kind of be congregated in a little area along here, and you can use a variety of different baits in. You catch 2 or 3 on a Carolina rig. I see people do this all the time. They don't get a bite and they crank up and leave. Next guy comes right in there and throws a crankbait and catches 2 or 3, and he leaves. If they stop hitting that Carolina rig, pick up a crankbait and throw it in there 4 or 5 times. If they quit hitting the crankbait in the Carolina rig, throw your Texas rig woo worm in there, bounce it along, see if you can't catch a fish. You know, a lot of times when you're fishing a river system that has a lot of dams in it, or something maybe like the Alabama River, it doesn't have a lot of current in the summer. It's what I call a slow meandering type river. You'll have a lot of little underwater they're not exactly points, they're kind of flats that come out off the side of the river. And these rivers are generally a little bit deeper than your tidewater rivers. Over next to the bank, you might have 10 or 15 foot. And what I'll do, I'll get over close to the bank, just run along with my boat and watch my depth finder till I come up on a break, and then just follow it out around and kind of mark it maybe with a couple marker buoys if I want to, till I find out where it comes back in. Then I'll turn around and fish right back up it with a deep crankbait like a Model A6 or a 3/4 ounce rattle trap, or maybe a Pose 400. You know, a lot of times when you're fishing a river, you see a big barge go by, it'll throw a wave, and if you're near a gut or something, when that water washes up in those guts, a lot of times it'll stir up the bait fish, and you'd be surprised at the amount of fish you can catch. Hey, this is a concrete example of what we're trying to tell you about. Here's a little opening off the river, goes back and forms a pocket back in there, but it's real shallow right here in the mouth of this thing. And when that barge comes by, throwing a wave, everything's kind of dead here right now still. When that wave washes up in there, it'll actually kind of wash in and wash back out, and it'll move all the minnows, get them to scurrying all around and moving out. And all these bass are probably laying along this ledge out in here, and they know, they're trained. They know the minnows are going to start moving when that wave comes in, and they'll pull right in here and they'll feed for 2 or 3 minutes. And I've actually followed a barge down a river 2 or 3 different times in tournaments, just looking for these cuts, and sit there when the waves would wash up in and wash out, and then I'd fish for 5 or 10 minutes, maybe catch 2 or 3 fish, and then run down to the next cut. So that's a good pattern to use sometimes on river fishing if you got a lot of barge traffic. Every major river system you fish on will have a lot of bridges that crosses it. And these bridges are going to have concrete pilings holding them up, and these things are just like having a nice big rock sitting in the water, or a big post on a dock or anything. That's going to create a current break. In other words, when that water hits the front of that and comes by the back, you get that back current, and a lot of bait fish are going to hang around these pilings. And somewhere along, they might be up on the front end, or they might be on the back. And I'll fish these with a variety of different lures. I like to, if you got a lot of, say, Kentucky bass in the lake, I like to fish like a brown jig or a brown gets it. If I'm fishing for a largemouth, a lot of times I'll throw something like a rattle trap or a small 4-inch worm. Depending on the amount of current you got, what size weight head you're going to use and everything. A grub works real good in a place like this. Just a little 2-inch twister grub on a lead head. Just flip it over and let it down, work a lot of different depths till you find out where the fish are holding. You know, riprap's always a key structure on any body of water, but again, in rivers and tidewater rivers or normal rivers, I think it's a little more key than it is in a major lake or something, simply because you have the current. And it positions the fish generally on one of the two corners of the riprap. It'll either be upstream or downstream. Occasionally you can run down the sides and catch one, but 90% of the bass are caught off one of the two corners. So again, when you come in to fish a spot like this, you basically know right off the bat that the fish are probably going to be within a little 30 yards or 20 yard section right in here, or either up on the other corner. And you can fish this again with crankbaits, spinner baits, buzz baits real early in the morning, a worm. You have to kind of fish a worm on a light sinker and kind of swim it over the rocks, keep it from hanging up. But this is a real key place, and I probably want to use a crankbait number one more than anything. A rattle trap again, or a Fire Tiger Model A is a real popular bait in river systems. And again, most of your bridges and that you find, this is a kind of a unique one here because it's got a little cut in the back of it. You've actually got 4 different corners. When the water gets up and it comes through the back side here, you've actually got 4 spots that could hold bass pretty good. And I know this is a key place when you've got a little bit of moving water going one way or the other. And a lot of your bridges are built like this, especially long bridges that come out in rivers. Sometimes where they've got the different pilings positioned on little islands and stuff like this, it'll leave little ditches, so to speak, in between some of the pilings. And any of those are subject to hold bass. Seasons are another thing, you know, I want to mention to you. In a basic river system, I like to probably fish shallow back in the creeks in the spring and late fall. And I'll still venture back there some in the summer, but in the summertime, say late spring, all through the summer and the early fall, I'm going to spend my time looking for these ditches, these humps, these channel bends, these channel swings, just any kind of underwater structure that'll hold that bass. And this is where the map really comes in handy, because there's so many good maps out there now. And you know, just get one and go out there and try it. Spend a little bit of time, because nothing's easy in fishing, and especially structure fishing. You know, here we are in a good current condition. The one thing I want to caution you about, when I make a cast, I don't mind pulling my lure across the current or with the current, but I don't ever want to pull it against the current. I catch very few fish pulling that lure upstream for some reason. I think it's just not a natural look or something. You know, as you'll watch this lure when it hits the water, of course, you can see the leaves and stuff going by too. But you look, there's 2 seconds and that lure has gone about 4 feet down in that current. When I reel it down now, I'm 5 feet down below where that bass is hiding. He's going to be right up next to that current break. So I want to make a Kentucky Windage type cast about 3 or 4 feet upstream even. Sometimes you can even let the lure drift down a little bit then. But you want to pull it where that lure is reaching its maximum depth, right in that break where that fish should be hiding. You know, you could even cast 6 feet upstream and let it drift back. but don't throw right on the targets, what I'm trying to tell you, with a worm or anything else. A worm, a lot of times when you're in current like this, or a jig, we might go to a heavier bait to get that lure down in there. But we're still, even with a 1 ounce jig here, we'd have to allow for this current. We'd have to flip it upstream just a little bit farther. But if we throw a light lure over there, it would just, even with the current and everything, it would carry it on down, and you'd just be wasting your time fishing that day because you're not getting your lure into the strike zone where the fish is going to be hiding. So think about that. You've got to get the lure where the fish is. You know, anytime you're riding up a river system and you see muddy water coming in, and a lot of times we get rains back in the creeks or up on the upper end of the river, and that mud comes down through there, and you can see here where the stained water is hitting the clear water. And that's a key place. I don't know what it is. I guess it just stirs everything up right there, and the bait fish love to hang right on the edge of that, and all kinds of fish. You know, I don't even care what kind of fishing you're doing. This is a fantastic place to look for just any species of fish, but especially the bass. I think they, for some reason or other, I've actually followed them down the river. In other words, I come here today, like you see this mud pushing out, and come back tomorrow, and this mud might be 2 miles down that river, a mile down that river, and the fish seem to push right along in front of it where you've got the clear water meeting the muddy water. Here we've got a major power plant on the side of the river, and a lot of your rivers all over the country, and some of your lakes too, you'll find these plants on them, especially in your lakes up in the river. But what it is, it's a hot water discharge, and it's where they're taking water in there to cool their generators and stuff down, and it warms that water up, and they're putting it back into the river. And in the wintertime, this can make a real good place to catch fish, but it's not a bad place to fish year-round. I've fished in this very one right here when it was 100-degree water temperature coming out of there, but I think it also puts a lot of oxygen in the water. And sometimes, even though it's hot, the bass will come there before the oxygen. I'll usually find the fish positioned on one side or the other of this water. Like, if you can see it coming out here, it kind of makes a little eddy on the lower side and also on the upper side. So I'd try and cast I'll make 3 or 4 casts to one side, work it out. If I don't get a bite, then I'll turn around and throw up to the other side and try and find out where the fish are located. Sometimes you can hum it right up in the middle of that boiling water and catch one, but I think that's only when they're like running bait fish up in there. Another key place on rivers to look for, and I've found this all over the country, is they'll have a lot of what we call old boat graveyards, I guess you would call it. They'll take old barges and old boats that are not any good anymore, and they'll pull them up into a bay or something and knock holes in them, fill them up with rocks, and sink them. And this makes a perfect heaven for a bass. He's got all kinds of little holes to get up in, plenty of shade again, wood, cover. Bait fish are going to come in and hang around that, and it just makes an ideal place. And the nice thing about a lot of these boats, you'll see, they pull them up on the bank, and you've got one end up real shallow water, and the other end comes out into deep water. So if the fish are out deep, later in the summer, you might fish out on the end of the barges. In the spring, they'll get right up on top of these things and spawn. You know, like you can see with the water down 3 or 4 feet here, this is the side of the boat going down right here. Well, normally that would be 3 foot underwater. Well, if you came along here fishing and didn't know it, you might just be fishing all up there and go on. But what we want to do is take a crankbait, sit out here and bring it down. In other words, I throw my crankbait up there like that, I bring it down, and it hits that piece of wood and bounces off. Probably going to catch a fish when the water's up. It would be a perfect place for them to hide. So, you know, any river that we're talking about will have all these basically same types of structure in them, and you'll fish them basically the same way. You know, if I had to pick one type of structure to fish, be it on a lake or a river, but especially on a river, I'd pick a dock. Every river system we fish in the country is usually loaded with boat docks. Every one I've ever been on anyway. This one right here happens to be a classic example of where there was an old pier. You can see with the water down where there used to be an old pier here, and they've came along and built a new pier over top of it. And you'll find that a lot of times. But you've got shade, wood, place for the minnows to hide all around in here. And generally when a pier comes out off the bank, the water starts real shallow, and if you look at the graph, you'll see where it comes out, maybe to 3 foot, and all of a sudden there's a little drop off somewhere. And usually right on that drop off, the closest pilings to that drop off is going to be where the bass hang out. You know, we've got two types of docks here right next to each other, and they actually create two different types of structure. We've got a floating dock. It's got a lot of styrofoam on it, and the next one up here, as you see, is basically just pilings driven up in the ground. And one thing I like about these docks, if you notice, there's nothing fancy about them. They're small docks, and I figured a guy that's got a dock like this is probably a fisherman. He's going to have a brush pile under there for crappie. I'm going to flip a little worm or a jig up in there, feel around a little bit, and you know, sure enough, right there's a brush pile just plain as day. Now, if this is a big fancy dock or something, I don't even waste time fishing them usually, because those people are water skiers. They're not going to take time to build a brush pile. So on the floating dock, I'm looking for a fish to be suspended on that styrofoam in the sun. If not, I want to fish around it and see if there is a brush pile. Maybe idle around with my wide eye depth finder and look out front also. Now here we've got stationary piling, and that offers something all the way to the bottom that the fish can relate to, so you really wouldn't need a brush pile. You know, but a lot of times you'll find brush around these too, and I especially like this one because the dock's about half sunk here. Again, creating something for minnows to hide around and bass to hide around. This would be a nice dock to find a fish. You notice you got shade, even though it's a high dock right now, you got shade about halfway under there. I'm gonna look for that fish in that shady areas first. Just flip it up under there in that shade and work it along. There's some structure. No, it ain't either. That's a fish. Come on. This feels like a good fish here. Come on. That's what I'm talking about. Come on, big boy. That's a nice dock fish right there. That's a nice any type of anywhere. Come on. Come on, daddy. Hey, big boy. Yowza. Now that's what we're talking about. The little old bitty woo worm and the great big old bass. I love it. I'll tell you what, you can't ask for a prettier fish than that anywhere. I don't care if you're in Florida, New York, or California. Healthy, wealthy, and wise, because he knew when he bit the woo worm I was going to turn him loose and let him grow up a little bit bigger. Thanks a lot. Go back over to that dock. We'll be back to see you. There he goes, heading in the right direction. You know what, we're fishing a river here where we've had a flood condition, and we see this just about every year on our major river systems, and a lot of trees will get washed over in the water. And one thing I always look for, a tree with green leaves on it. To me, this is just like a bass hotel. The fish he just got shade. Usually the bait fish get up in there, and it's a key place to find fish, and they'll move right into it, I think, the day after the tree falls over in the water. A jig, a worm is probably the two major lures that we're going to use, because we can pitch those right over in the center of stuff and let them drift right down in that shady area where it's tight. The bass will get tight in there when the sun's shining. Another thing, when you've got high water on even on lakes, but on rivers especially, you get a lot of this, as you'll notice on the water here where I'm getting ready to flip my jig, and I guess it's leaves, pine needles, just a conglomeration of brown stuff that'll mat up against the bank or up in these trees and stuff, and it usually occurs for 2 or 3 days after a flood. Once the water gets down, the wind blows around, it usually leaves. But the bass love to get up under that stuff for some reason, and that's a place we always look for if we've had a high water condition. One key thing I want you to remember when you fish a tree like this tree's laying up in a foot of water and the end of it's probably in 6 or 8 foot. Somewhere along under there's going to be a drop off on one of these limbs. You come around the side like this and just watch your depth finder. It'll usually tell you when you come up, and that's where I like to flip my jig or worm the very first time. You know, some people are afraid that when you got fresh vegetation like that, it depletes the water of oxygen. And I usually think it takes maybe 2 to 3 weeks when the leaves start turning real brown and everything. A lot of times the fish will move off that structure for 2 or 3, maybe a month or 2. And then once the leaves leave, they'll move back into your old roots and tree limbs and stuff. So don't worry about that. If you got green leaves, fish it. There he is. That's a nice one. Come right out of that cold water on that jig. Come here, big boy. That's a nice jig fish coming out of that green tree. That tree's probably been down 2 or 3 days since the flood. Just goes to show you. It's about a 2.5 pound bass. The old J-Mac jig come through again. That's something you can put down in that heavy cover. We're going to let him go back, grow up about another 1/2 pound. I really appreciate you. Goodbye. Let's just reach in there and see if we can pull another one out. There he is. Good. Our drag's loose. Come out of there. Come on. Golly day. Now that's what I'm talking about. That's what we're looking for in here. Right in the thick of it, we've got bright sunshine, very little wind right now. That fish was backed right up tight under that thickest log in there with that brown stuff over it. And that's a pretty bass right there. I'll take him every day in every tournament and be a happy man. I'm gonna put you right back in that tree, but don't bite the next jig that comes in there because I won't be back for a while. That's a beautiful river fish right there, about 4 pounds. We're gonna let him go and hopefully catch him again another day. You know, as a general rule, fishing rivers, I want to keep my baits a little to the small side. Not always, but most of the time, probably 80%. The second thing is I want to fish into the current all the time. It's very important, you know, to go into the current. And one reason is if you hook a fish, you know, generally there's going to be a gang up there a lot of times. Your boat won't run right into where the fish is and spook them. You hook that fish, you'll be drifting downstream. Another tip on the river, I very seldom look for a fish over 5 foot deep unless you don't have any current. If the current's dead and they're not pulling any water maybe way up in the river, you might drift on out and fish in the 15 to 20 foot water. But most of the time I want probably a 5 foot break or less. You know, we're pulling my bait where it comes off 5 and maybe drops into 15 or 20. But as long as that current's going, they're usually moving in kind of shallow and everything to feed. I'll tell you one thing, he hit it hard. Probably a catfish. Ooh. A little Mepps spinner done stuck in him. He said, what in the world is this little thing doing hurting me like this? Yeah. That is a nice river bass there. That's about as big as you're going to want to catch. And that little lure I was telling you about, that Mepps spinner, I've caught a lot of big fish on it. Does a great, fantastic job. Come right off the isolated structure we talked about earlier in the video. You know, this is only about the 4th piece of isolated structure that we've actually hit today. I'm I'm gonna let you go back. And there you go, big boy. Go on back. I hope you've enjoyed this video. We've tried to cover everything we could in the amount of time that we've had. I'm sure there's a few things we've missed, and maybe we'll get that on another one at a later date. But review this video, go back through everything, watch it several times now, and good luck on your next fishing trip. And whatever you do, take a kid fishing. Thank you.